I made a thing. Hello, my name is Victoria and I like to be cozy, and I started documenting the process of making things so that I can show other people and have something to show off without dragging the project around. So I wanted to go over the making of this cozy cat's quilt, creative cat's quilt, that I made over the course of roughly about a year. I made it using a process called English paper piecing. And the thing I like about English paper piecing is that each step can take so long that by the time you've finished a quilt like this, going back to the beginning is a totally new process. So let's get back to the beginning in April of last year. Hello. Oh, there's a light directly in my face. Oh, let's see how this goes. Hello, my name is Victoria and I like to be cozy, and I started documenting the process of making things so that I can show other people and have something to show off without dragging the project around. So I wanted to go over the making of this cozy cat's quilt, creative cat's quilt, that I made over the course of roughly about a year. I made it using a process called English paper piecing. And the thing I like about English paper piecing is that each step can take so long that by the time you've finished a quilt like this, going back to the beginning is a totally new process. So let's get back to the beginning in April of last year. So April of last year, I started plotting out this quilt. I have a number of detailed elements to this one that I didn't have in my first English paper pieced quilt. I started English paper piecing because during COVID, my mom had a lot of scraps from masks and there were a lot of weird shapes. And I can't remember exactly where I found it, but I found out about the process of English paper piecing. And I was like, well, I can cut out little hexagons and glue them to the paper and just use up all of the space in it to make a quilt. And so that's where this guy came from. I can go over that one in a separate video. But for my next fully paper pieced quilt for myself, I made another one, a baby quilt for a friend of mine. But for my next one for me, I wanted to include some really cool things, and I found this Timeless Treasures cat fabric that had all these paint splattered cats on them. And so I ordered it and I got it in, and I realized that these cats are so big that they don't fit into 1-inch hexagons. So I decided to modify the traditional grandmother's garden pattern, which involves like making big flowers and then creating little paths around them to show off these cats. So I created a little template to window cut the cats out of, and then applique these circles around. Fit into 1-inch hexagons. So I decided to modify the traditional grandmother's garden pattern, which involves like making big flowers and then creating little paths around them to show off these cats. So I created a little template to window cut the cats out of, and then applique these circles around. So I started by fussy cutting these guys because I wanted to do something a little bit different than the other windows. And again, with how the fabric worked, doing them in this diamond shape was really good for making sure I got each of the individual cats in. So I started off with fussy cutting the rainbow cats and cutting out all of these colorful hexagons and kind of plotting how many I needed.
So all the audio on my TikToks cut out, which is fine. This is my plan that I had for how many windows and hexagon flowers I was going to do, counting up my rows so I can get an approximate count for how many I needed to cut out, because it all started with these guys. So they are the perfect size to fit in those little hexagons, which I'll show overlaying them. So I really wanted to highlight them with the diamond shapes. So I'm going to have my templates and I'm going to judge based on them around the shape of the individual cats and then cut them out. So I have a few lined up here. Fussy cutting just means I'm not going for the most coverage of my fabric. I'm going for the piece I want to center. So I take my little guide ruler here, and I can get some of them really close together because I only need a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I cut them out and I can fold all my corners over. And I have these cute, adorable little guys that I love so much.
And I will go over the exact statistics of how many hexagons, diamonds, and windows there are. So once I had cut out all my hexagon pieces and all my diamonds, I glued them down to the fabric, cut out the fabric, and then what I like to do is when I'm waiting somewhere or before my shift starts or something, I will take out my little tin that I have with the pieces that I need to baste, and I will fold the edges of the fabric around the paper piece and baste on the corners, not through the paper and the fabric like some people do. I just find that that works a lot better, and then I can be lazier and not have to take out my basting stitches later. So I do that process for a while until I have enough built up. I iron them all down so they're all nice and flat, and then I begin the process of putting the different flowers together. So I started with the diamond cats, and then I went around in an alternating pattern with the other 3 fabrics. And then once I had all the diamond cats done, I put together the frames for these guys, and then I cut the windows out using a template I made out of cardboard. So I took one of these finished ones, put it on top, traced around it so that I could have both a template for making sure that my cat was exactly centered or how I wanted it to look, and then I would take the inside portion and draw around it and then cut with 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that then I took the cats and I spray basted them on.
This is how I made the windows for my quilt. So I took this finished diamond piece and I used it as my template because these guys fit nicely in that size of a shape but not in the smaller ones. So I'm going to take this piece of cardboard and I'm going to trace around and cut out this shape. So I have a window so I can see exactly what I'm cutting out, as well as a piece to go around and trace with my pencil. So that way I can add my 1/4 inch seam allowance later and still make sure that I can get guys next to it on the fabric in the proper spacing. So like these guys right here. Then I take my temporary adhesive spray and just go around the edges so that I can attach it to my hexagon frame. This is a little bit of a sticky job, and the spray adhesive doesn't last forever, so the applicking does need to be done shortly thereafter. I'm not moving these too much by manipulating them by hand, so they held up very well for me, and there's a quick look.
Something else that I did differently for this quilt is I tried out a product called Terrio Magic. It is a starch fabric stabilizer that you dip the fabric into, take it out, let it dry a little bit, and then you iron it so that then it becomes very stiff and very paper-like. I used that for this, and it was very helpful for the windows because then it held shape very well for me as I put the windows down on top and then went to applique them on a sewing machine.
Here I had the sewing machine do the work for once, so I used my mom's Janome M7 and just a basic applique stitch going around, again with the Invisifil. Invisifil worked lovely for this. It doesn't show the stitches off too much, but it keeps it down nice and secure.
By the time I had done all my windows, then it was time to cut out these guys in between, these white guys. So what I wanted to do, because this is obviously so colorful, is I wanted to have the fabric go with it but not fight it. So this is actually a batik fabric. It's, I believe, leaves with kind of a rainbowed batik through as my insert pieces in between each of them. So I then cut all of those out, basted them again. So I've gone back to the beginning of the cycle, so something different again from what I had been doing. And then I proceeded to make, did I do columns or rows? I think I did rows. And I would actually recommend doing it as columns because it's a lot easier to shift back and forth along this corner of the hexagon rather than going in the other way of the hexagon. It just means a lot more maneuvering and a lot more folding of your paper pieces. Can be done, it's just a little bit more annoying than the other way. So once all of it was together, that's the actual piecing portion of the quilting done, and it's time to get to the actual quilting portion of the quilting. So I sandwiched the quilts on November 27th, 2022.
So now I have my quilt all sandwiched together. So there is my rainbow watercolor wide backing and my quilt top.
So from April 24th to November 27th, I had been working on putting this all together, cutting it out, all of that. So by November, I was actually on to putting this into one week. When I was actually quilting the quilts, again, I did something funky. I used Invisifil's, they have a rainbow pack, because again, this is very, very busy. I didn't want the quilting to stand out, but I wanted it to go with. So I went around each outside edge in alternating colors. So I have a red one here, this diamond beside it is red, and then I go into orange, orange, yellow, blue, and then start all over again. So I was kind of constantly changing my threads as I went, and I obviously went from the center out and went around each individual one, which meant a lot of maneuvering of the quilts. But again, I'm very lucky that my mother has a very good machine with a large throat space. So I did not notice any resistance from the machine. It was just a lot of arm pain from moving this big quilt. So then I did something also slightly insane, where that's all of these inside portions done, but I have a fear of things coming undone. So I did free motion quilting around each one. I wanted it to kind of look like paint dripping from the top. So I have, again, alternating sections of this is red, this is orange, this is yellow, kind of dripping down in between. I will say Invisifil is very good for making your stitches disappear, but I do not like it for free motion quilting. It's 100 weight polyester, which means it's very, very thin, and for going as fast, and free motion isn't as gentle is not the right word, but going as fast as you do with free motion quilting, I just found it broke more than I thought was acceptable. I did make adjustments to tension, but I just found it overall more aggravating. But it was definitely the right color choice for this quilt, as I'm finding threads I need to stitch, because it broke on me and I had to restart. So then I had my entire thing quilt, and that left binding. So I did 2.5 inches, folded over, stitched down to one side, and then flipped over, and I hand bound this portion. I would not recommend doing anything larger than a lap quilt in one day, or your hands will hate you. Definitely mine did. And before I put the binding on, I made my quilt label.
Here is the embroidery machine stitching out my quilt label. So it started here with my digitized paint splatter paw, and then it's going to move on to the lettering. They're just so mesmerizing to watch, and it's nice and secure.
Again, I have a need for things to stand up to the abuse of a toddler, so I do not like the idea of writing on it with marker, because I just feel like that's not going to hold up to as many times as I envision it going through the wash. So I have access to an embroidery machine through my mother, and also my town has one at its public library that I could use. So I stitched out my label. I also have access to embroidery software, so I was able to take a clip art picture of a cat's paw print in a splatter, as well as different paint splatters, and digitize them so that they came out as stitches to add to my quilt label. So I put that on the corner here. That's just how I like to do it, with the name of the quilt, my name, and when I created it, which is 2022 to 2023. By the time I was done quilting, I believe it was last weekend that I finished which would be the end of May.
And here is the final quilt just flapping in the breeze. My lovely sibling is holding it up for me, and you can see all the cats. It's not too distracting with that white in the middle, and you really get to see it show off. The Invisifill means that there's that texture there you can kind of see on the back, but you're not getting lost in the vibrancy of those stitches because everything else is just so vibrant.
Numbers. So this quilt has a total of 1,510 hexagons in it. 576 are in the flowers, so surrounding the diamonds and surrounding the cat windows, and 934 to surround them and create my borders around the quilt. There are 144 diamond pieces and 24 windows. I used, when I was doing this quilt, the new things that I wanted to try out were applique, which with some prep work, very, very easy. I highly recommend, especially if you're doing it in the same day, using a low tack temporary adhesive. I use 505 spray, but anything that's a low tack temporary adhesive, acid free, should do you good. Nothing in the hardware store, but Michael's always has a coupon. And I wanted to try out using different shapes, so I used the diamond in this quilt and got away from my beloved hexagons. I do have some extras from this, so that's not all that I cut out, because I have a new box started to start a new crazy quilt, hide and seek hexagon quilt, if you will, so I do have some extras from that, as well as I believe I have 2 extra windows. In this year, I also worked on, I believe I finished the Star Wars quilt for my best friend's wedding. I did a little dinosaur quilt that I have yet to give. I did a Halloween panel quilt. I did a panel quilt for the Florida Volume 2 bundle. So I've done a number of quilts in the same time as I've done this one. Paper piecing is a labor of love. It takes some time, but I think it's really worth it for the final project. And the point of creation, the point of crafting, is to have fun with it. And this is how I have fun with it. So if you want to see things as they're happening, I do a lot of Instagram, not as much Instagram, I do a lot of TikToks, because it's just easiest for me to film something quickly and put it up there so that it's being recorded and it's not a big deal in my brain. I have a lot of family on Instagram, so it feels a little bit more daunting. But Instagram and TikTok is where you can find me. As well, I have a Ko-fi, which is linked if you want to support my habit of fabric buying, because I am definitely inspired by a fabric creator. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope I'll see you again.